These are your fast facts on the book of Philemon. First, slavery was common in the Roman Empire. Various estimates on the slave population of the Roman Empire range from 1 in 10 to 1 in 3 people, depending on the methods used and the location being evaluated. The larger the population center or the wealth of the region, the more widespread the practice became. Slavery was legal from the earliest days of the Roman Republic and was part and parcel to their entire way of life. Second, slavery in the first century differed drastically from chattel slavery in the modern era. Slavery was not based on race or heritage. In fact, one of the philosophers' counsels during this era was for wealthy individuals to be moderate in their lifestyles, lest they become slaves in the end. Slavery was frequently the outcome of failed crops or overwhelming debts. If someone couldn't pay, they would indenture themselves to someone who could pay the debt. They would provide service while being housed, clothed, and often educated. Some would eventually purchase their freedom or would be granted freedom. Many held white-collar, respectable roles in society. It is true that masters had a wide range of permissions on how they could treat their slaves, but most philosophers and teachers frowned on any kind of negative or harmful behavior, even while underscoring the natural right of masters to rule over their slaves. Much of this kind of practice in the first century is contrary to the practice of slavery, for example, in the Americas, where race and heritage were driving factors behind the enslavement and hostage-taking of people from the continent of Africa. Slavery was universally a forced labor. Further, manumission in the United States, particularly in the southern states, was not allowed to many slave masters. Slaves, in fact anyone with dark skin, were by and large disallowed from participation in any role outside of manual labor. Further, slaves were frequently abused physically and sexually in the United States and were subjected to all manner of horrible treatment, such as separation from spouses and children. In summary, there were significant differences in the kind of slavery that Paul addressed in his day and the slavery that is most recognizable to people today. Probably the best parallel to this kind of slavery is seen in many countries today, where jobs are hard to come by and people end up seeking employment at factories that allow them to feed their families but provide little to no hope of ever saving enough money to move out of the on-site housing and gain upward mobility in society. Third, Paul's approach to slavery was equally nuanced. Instead of condemning Philemon for the practice of owning slaves, a practice that was likely to the benefit of Onesimus, assuming that Onesimus had fallen behind on payments and was being paid off via indenturement to Philemon, Paul takes a more cautious approach. In our video on the book of Ephesians, we saw how Paul undercuts the power dynamic that was the norm in the slave-master relationship. Here, Paul goes a step further and implies to Philemon that the fact that Onesimus was a fellow believer made his continuing as a master problematic. Fourth, we can guess that Philemon released Onesimus. The very fact that we have this letter in our canon seems to indicate that Paul's plea didn't land on deaf ears. As we mentioned in the video on Colossians, this letter was likely pulled into the canon by its connection to the larger epistle, but it would not have entered that canon had it not produced the intended effect. Philemon must have responded well to this little letter, demonstrating the power of Christianity to deconstruct the brokenness of slavery. According to early church history, Onesimus was released and went on to become the bishop of Ephesus, and perhaps an inscription in Laodicea by a freed slave in honor of his former master, Marcus Cestius Philemon, hints in this direction as well. Fifth, Onesimus was likely a runaway slave hiding out in Rome. As we discussed in the video on Ephesians, the pastoral epistles likely originated from Rome. The bustling metropolis gave Onesimus the easiest place to hide, but if he were ever identified, he would have been subject to torture, branding, or even death. Paul likely would have been subject to similar treatment had he continued knowingly sheltering Onesimus during that house arrest as described there in Acts 28. Sixth, the letter to Philemon wasn't just to Philemon. In verse 2, Paul addresses the letter to 2 others in Philemon's household and then to the entire church that worshiped with him. Throughout the letter, Paul employs the careful use of social pressure, including the pressure of an entire assembly of which Philemon played an important role, to drive him to do the right thing by Onesimus. And those are your fast facts on the book of Philemon.